Every legion, every army, no matter how powerful it is, needs a good plan and a good strategy. And for it to be effective, it needs exceptional knowledge of the terrain. Get to know the scouts and the foragers here and now. Reconnaissance of the terrain is a necessity that all armies throughout history have needed. From sending men running as an advance party thousands of years ago, to the use of drones and satellites today, knowledge is power. Reconnaissance is as simple as sending soldiers ahead of the army to see what the path the legions will take is like, and in general, any aspect the general needs to know. Alright, let's first get to know the Procursators. These men were not a specific unit, meaning there wasn't a unit that had the category of Procursators as such, but rather, these men were chosen from among the army. At first they were equids, but over time they usually became mounted troops, allied or auxiliary cavalry. If for some reason there were no horses, light troops had to be sent, like the velites during the Republic. If you haven't seen the video about the velites up here, I'll leave you the link so you can learn everything about them. The number of Procursators was very low, between 1% and 5% of the army. The function of these units was to serve as a kind of protective screen against any threat, as well as to detect enemy movements near the main body of the army. One of their tasks was to detect enemy informants or scouts, to prevent them from learning the exact number and disposition of the legion. In addition to being able to capture enemy scouts who could provide valuable information, or even detect the position of the enemy army if it was nearby. Another of their tasks was to inform the general about which route was most suitable for the army. That is, these men would scout both paths at a fork and decide which one would be most appropriate to reach the objective, taking into account things like the amount of food and water available, the layout of the terrain, as well as whether one area was more favorable than another for an ambush. Obviously, the final decision was generally his, but it was reasonable to take advice from these men. Although it's true that by taking advice from scouts and explorers, Varus fell into a trap. But this is just the exception that proves the rule. Once the route to Tuos is separated in Abertuntundes, the procurators were tasked with securing it. And what did this consist of? Well, first of all, it consisted of clearing the path of enemies, securing a small perimeter. They also removed any obstacles that prevented the legions from marching comfortably and safely. For example, if there was a fallen tree blocking the way, the Procursators would take care of removing it. These men could be supported by light infantry to carry out these tasks, such as javelin throwers or archers. As a final function, these men helped during foraging operations, obtaining supplies from the land for the legion, of the type of food or any material that it needed, and that could be obtained nearby. The tasks of the Procursators lasted a day or less even, and they moved away from the army between 1 and 5 kilometers, no more. Let's say it was under the jurisdiction of another type of unit. Better known than the Procursators were the Exploratores. Unfortunately, the Procursatores are very little known, so we could try to make history judge them as they deserve. And how can we achieve that? Very easy. Like the video, comment, share it with your friends, and most importantly, join the Hispanic Guard by subscribing to the channel. The scouts operated at a distance of more than 30 kilometers around the army, and their tasks could last several days or even weeks. So they had to carry a certain amount of rations and in addition, be able to survive with whatever they could forage. Like the precursors, these men did not have their own unit, at least for most of Rome's history. Well, towards the end of the empire, exclusive scout units began to appear whose only function was to act as scouts. They consisted of mounted light troops and had various functions, although the main one, as their name indicates, was to scout. They had to gather all the possible information about what the legions would encounter in the future. They had to find and record the villages they encountered, as well as the number of inhabitants and their defenses. They had to find out if any important event had occurred that affected the regions. For example, if levies were being gathered, if a leader was preparing an attack, or if a village was angry with its rulers. They could find this out thanks to the spies that the Romans had stationed, whom we will learn about in another video. When it's ready, I'll put the link at the top of the screen. Anything, no matter how small, could make the difference between life and death for the legionaries who came behind and relied on them. They also located the positions of enemy troops and had to estimate their numbers and, if possible, their quality. That is, whether they were seasoned warriors, mere peasants, whether they were well armed, if they had horses, anything at all. Finally, they analyzed the topography of the area. Among other things, they looked for places where the legions could camp safely for the night. Normally, a clearing elevated above the surrounding terrain, allowing for a considerable range of vision over the area. And very importantly, the ideal was that there would be enough building materials and drinking water nearby. When the place for the camp was chosen, these men would hang up bonfires. It's not exactly known what the purpose was, but there could have been two. On one hand, to guide the army to the point where they would camp. On the other hand, to provide the legionaries with warmth when they arrived at the area. Next, they helped the engineers with their tasks to design the camp. Until finally the vanguard of the army arrived, which began the construction work based on the engineers' instructions. We must keep in mind when we analyze the scouts that at this time maps were a luxury, and the ones that did exist left much to be desired. So the information these men provided was of vital importance to the general. It was with this information that the officers were able to establish a strategy for their campaign and a tactic for the battles that would take place. Which forest could be a problem? Which geographical features would prevent an enemy from flanking the army? Where could a river be crossed? All the necessary information was provided by these men. As secondary functions, these men could cause chaos behind enemy lines, for example, by driving away livestock, setting fire to crops, or even poisoning the wells that the enemy army was using. They could also carry out riskier actions, such as attacking enemy supply lines or even carrying out assassination missions against enemy targets. They could set up small ambushes against groups of enemy troops as well as try to take down their scouts. I mentioned that their missions could last days or weeks before returning to the main army. So how did the scouts organize themselves? Well, these men would go in medium-sized groups, and when they had moved away from the army, they would establish a meeting point and agree to meet there when they finished their exploration. Then they would subdivide into smaller groups and branch out. When they achieved their objectives, they would share the information among themselves. If there was something of special relevance, of special importance, one of the scouts would return to the main body of the army to inform them. Meanwhile, the rest would resume the march and establish another meeting point to repeat the process. In summary, we've seen that the Roman legions had two layers of scouts: the Procursators, who operated closest to the legion, and the explorers, who worked farther away.